Hello everybody! So far we've gone over the basic mechanics of the game, and we've looked at how positioning can help you win individual rounds. Now I think it's time to look at the bigger picture and talk about long-term strategy and Super Auto Pets. At this point you should be able to make it to the later rounds consistently without much trouble, like rounds 10 and above, but in the late game you might be running up against stronger squads with really big units, and knocking you out before you can get to 10 wins yourself. If that happens every now and then, don't sweat it, it's just the RNG of the game. But if you're consistently losing in the late game, then maybe it's time to focus on your overall strategy to see if there's anything you can improve there. This guide will go over the core concepts of animal archetypes and team composition, and how these two things should inform your long-term strategy in the game. One thing to notice, this video was written and recorded before the patch with the rooster nerf, so examples will be referring to animals before the big nerf. Whereas some of the examples may not apply anymore, the core concepts are still relevant, and in my opinion always will be. Okay, so what are animal archetypes? Well, it's just a way of grouping animals up into specific roles, kind of like in an RPG party. For example, in every good RPG party, you need a good blend of abilities. A tank to absorb damage, a ranger to dish out the damage, and a healer to keep everyone alive. You get the point. In Super Auto Pets, there are also different archetypes of animals, each serving a different purpose with their own strengths and weaknesses. Understanding the role that each animal play can help you in building better teams overall. Okay, enough preamble. I'm sure everything will make sense once we start talking about specific examples. In my opinion, there are 6 different archetypes in Super Auto Pets, and those are buffers, scalers, tempo, traders or disruptors, food, and special animals. So let's look at the first animal archetype we'll cover, the buffer. A buffer is an animal that can provide consistent scaling to other units at the cost of being weak in combat itself. Some examples of buffers are monkeys, dragons, penguins, poodles, you get the idea. By themselves, buffers don't really help you out in combat, but it helps your team get steadily stronger every turn. I'll do a video on each of the animal archetypes later in the future, but for now, in my opinion, the best buffers are monkey, T-Rex, and dragon. Next, let's take a look at the scaler. This is the logical counterpart to the buffer. If you have a buffer, you need to pick an animal to buff. Rather than buffing any arbitrary animal, it's usually better to pick an animal that will benefit from the stats the most. And this is where the scaler comes in. A scaler is just any type of animal that will benefit more from being buffed. The scaler is almost always going to be a strongest unit that will carry your team in the late game. However, you may need to spend a lot of resources to buff it up in the mid game. In my opinion, there are 2 different types of scalers. Animals that are easy to buff, and animals with combat effects that do well with more stats. For the first type of scalers, you have animals like the dog, worm, and bison. These animals have an effect that make them easier to buff, which means combined with a buffer, you are able to outscale your opponent. As we've mentioned in the previous video, even a small stat increase can convert to a big advantage. This type of scaler is more important to have in the early to mid game, but they're usually still strong enough to keep around in the late game. For the second type of scalers, you have animals like rooster, rhino, and leopard. These animals aren't any easier to buff than others, but have combat abilities that synergize amazingly well with stats. Buffing these animals will take some more time, but you can get a strong late game carry out of it. Alright, now let's go over tempo animals. If all you have on your team are buffers and scalers, you're going to be too weak in the early to mid game, since those units take many turns to ramp up. This is where tempo units come in. These are units that are strong enough with little to no extra setup, but has less potential to scale. Like the scaler, I also think there are 2 different subtypes of tempo animals. First are the animals that are strong because they either have good stats to start with, or a good flat effect. By flat, I just mean that the effect does not scale with stats. Rather, you have to level up in order to level their effect up. A good example of an animal with a flat effect is the deer. At level 1, it spawns a 5/5 bust that has chili attack. That's pretty strong on turn 5 if you can get it via leveling up a unit. However, you have to level up the deer in order to upgrade the bus, and even at level 3, the bus is still just a 15/15. The chili attack also does not improve at all. This means that while the deer is strong early on, it scales off pretty quickly. Other units with good flat effects are the sheep, spider, and dolphin. The other type of tempo unit is what I like to call piggybackers. No relation. Piggybackers are basically units that rely on other units to activate. Good examples are the kangaroo and the crab. This means that you can just drop one of them into your team and, provided you already have a decent unit, these can piggyback, hence the name, off of the strong unit and be quite strong without any additional investment. Now let's talk about the closely related archetypes to tempo units, traders and disruptors. These are tempo units in the sense that they provide value immediately and don't require resources to be strong. But in my mind, they are different from tempo units because they play a slightly different role. This is because unlike tempo units, they stay relevant in the late game. In a sense, they become stronger the stronger your opponent gets. This is because traders and disruptor units are there to nullify your opponent's units, and they are often the best units at trading up. A good example of a trader is the Scorpion. Whereas the Scorpion is always good, the later on in the game it gets, the more valuable it becomes. The Skunk is another good example of this type of unit. These units are good to nullify your opponent's threats, but aren't that powerful in and of themselves. So you need a strong team around these units for best results. That's why I often only spec into them later on in the game. The next type of animal we're going to talk about is the simplest one of all, food. Yep, that's it. These are animals you buy for a one-time buff. This can be a straight up buff whenever you buy one, like the otter, or a cell effect, like the beaver, or even a feint effect, like a flamingo or an ant. These animals aren't especially good at combat, but provide you with valuable buffs. So if you can extract the buff value out of them and then sell them, then you get to keep the best part of their ability without having to spend an animal slot on them. The time to buy these guys are whenever you feel like the stats are worth the gold cost. Basically use these guys like food, which is why they're called food. Okay, and finally we get to our final archetype of animals. These are animals that don't really fall into any of the categories cleanly, either because they have such a unique effect, or because you can combo them to build an entirely different playstyle. Some examples of animals belonging to this category are the tiger, the turkey and fly combo, and the hedgehog. The tiger because its effect is so flexible, and turkey, fly, and hedgehog because those animals allow you to build a team in such a way that you can completely disregard everything in this guide. Those animals and builds simply do not belong in this framework. And I think that's fine. I think trying to put everything into one framework is a bit reductive anyway. If you really want a classification for them, I guess you could call them combo pieces. They're animals where stats don't really matter, but you usually need very specific team compositions and leveled up animals in order to make it work. Now that we've covered all the archetypes, we can finally talk about how to put them together. In general, you need a good balance of every type of unit. In my opinion, the most consistent way to play is not to rely on specific combo pieces to show up. Whereas Turkey Fly is a great combo, an overall game strategy that relies on getting those two animals would not be very consistent. Using these archetypes to build a team will allow your overall game plan to be more flexible, to accommodate different animals and combos as they become available to you. Because animals of the same archetype fulfill similar roles, they are easily interchangeable. For example, it doesn't really matter if you have a monkey, a dragon, or a T-Rex. It's going to buff your team just the same. If you don't manage to find a monkey early on, you can run a giraffe or penguin until Mr. Monkey Man shows up. Or if you don't find a dog to scale on turn 3, you can still buy a couple of tempo units and wait until you get a rooster or a rhino to scale. Now that you understand the ideas behind animal archetypes, it's up to you to balance exactly how many animals from each category you want to run. Experiment with different ratios and try to see what works. To get you started, I can give you a few tips and advice on how I usually build my own teams. Usually, I like to run one scaler in the early to mid game and two scalers in the late game. Early on, I always try to run at least one buffer, and a second one if my team is strong enough. As for the rest of the units, I fill it up with tempo animals, usually 2 of them. Then, when I reach the late game, I'll swap out the tempo units with either another scaler, a good combo animal if I found one, or with traders. Trying to keep 3 or more scalers is usually a bad idea, since you don't have the resources to buff them all. Similarly, trying to keep more than 2 buffers is also usually a bad idea, since your team becomes so weak that you're likely to lose the round. Keeping lots of tempo units can be good in the short term, but as the late game rolls around, you'll start to find that these units will fall off. If you can find a way to buff your entire team, like with a T-Rex, that's fine. But more often than not, I will try to replace those tempo units with traders, which are cheap, don't require buffing, and still provides a lot of value in the late game. So now we've covered all 3 areas of Super Auto Pet's knowledge. First, the mechanics, which help you maximize the value of your shop, then positioning, which helps you win rounds, and now overall strategy, which helps you win games. I've shared all my secrets and you're basically as good as the game as me now, so go play some games I guess? Anyway, if you're still interested in hearing me talk about each of the archetypes in length, I plan to do a video for each one and go into more detail about when to use them, how to evaluate how good they are, and a tier list for each archetype. So yeah, subscribe if you're interested. Till then, see you next time.